It was a quiet day in the deep space listening post, with no sign of the usual chaos that came with interstellar communications. The crew had just finished a routine scan when a strange, unidentified signal flashed across their monitors. The signal was weak at first, like a whisper in the vast silence of space, but it was clear enough to catch the attention of the officers on duty. Lieutenant Sarah Winters leaned closer to her console, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to decode the message. It was short, but the tone was urgent. The signal was coming from a sector of space known for being home to hostile alien forces. But what made this different was that the message seemed human. The message read, "Help us. We are under attack. Coordinates: Sector 97X. This is a distress signal from humanity. Please send help." At first, Sarah couldn't believe what she was seeing. The coordinates were in an area humans had long abandoned, a place known for being a dangerous and hostile part of the galaxy. She quickly alerted her superior, Captain Joshua Wright, who had a reputation for his calm and calculated demeanor under pressure. As Captain Wright examined the message, a tense silence filled the room. The distress call was clear, but the source was uncertain. Was it a trap, or was it a legitimate cry for help? There was no way to be sure. The sector was infamous for being occupied by the Xylar, a vicious alien species that had long been at odds with humanity. Could this be an attempt to lure humanity's war fleet into a deadly trap? "Should we send help?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. She had been stationed at this post for years, but this was the first time she had seen anything like this. Captain Wright paused. His eyes scanned the signal again, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that sending a fleet could be dangerous, but he also knew that leaving this message unanswered could lead to even worse consequences. There was a chance that whatever was happening out there might spread, or worse, that Xylar could learn that humanity was still out there, vulnerable. After a moment, Captain Wright made his decision. "We can't ignore it," he said firmly. "We'll send the fleet. Prepare the warships. We're going to investigate. But I want every single person on this post ready for a potential fight. We might be walking into a trap, but we need to find out." The order was given, and within hours, a fleet of the most powerful warships humanity had ever built began to mobilize. The ships were massive, with advanced weaponry and technology that could destroy entire planets. But even with all their power, the crew felt uneasy. They were heading into unknown territory, a place where danger lurked around every corner. But there was no turning back now. The countdown had begun. The war fleet was ready to depart. The massive warships of humanity's fleet were slowly coming to life, one by one, as the crew prepared for the most dangerous mission they had ever faced. Captain Joshua Wright stood at the front of the command deck, his eyes fixed on the star map that displayed the route to the unknown sector. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. This was what he was trained for, even if the risks were unlike anything he had faced before. Behind him, the crew was busy, each person working with laser focus. Lieutenant Sarah Winters, who had first detected the mysterious SOS, moved quickly between the consoles, making sure every communication link was secure. There was a constant buzz of activity in the room, and the crew seemed more alert than ever. They knew the stakes. If this mission went wrong, it could mean the end of humanity's presence in this part of the galaxy. In the war rooms below, the fleet's commanders were making their final preparations. These weren't just any ships. The fleet was made up of the most advanced warships ever built by humanity, each armed with weapons capable of wiping out entire fleets of alien ships. The lead ship, the Resolute, was a fortress in space, with armor and shields stronger than anything the Xylar or any other alien race had ever seen. Commander Elizabeth Harris, the tactical officer aboard the Resolute, ran through final checks. Her job was to make sure that everything, from the energy weapons to the hull integrity, was ready for battle. She was a sharp strategist, known for her ability to think several moves ahead, and this mission was no different. She knew that even though the fleet was powerful, they were going into unknown territory. The danger was real, and every move they made had to be calculated. As the fleet's engines powered up, the crew felt a collective sense of anticipation. This was the moment. There would be no turning back. The order to depart was given, and the massive ships began to drift away from the station, their engines humming as they powered through space. They were on a course for the unknown, moving toward the coordinates of the SOS signal. The stars outside seemed distant and cold, but inside the ships, the crew was anything but. Tension filled the air as the fleet left the safety of their home base and entered the vast emptiness of space. The warships moved as one, a symbol of humanity's strength and unity, ready to face whatever lay ahead. On board the Resolute, Captain Wright stood still, looking at the crew with a sense of quiet determination. His officers and crew were counting on him, but he had no illusions about the dangers they faced. This could be the last mission he ever commanded, and the thought weighed heavily on his mind. "We've trained for this," Captain Wright said, his voice steady, but his mind filled with questions. "Whatever we face out there, we face it together. Stay sharp." The crew nodded in unison, their nerves steeled by the captain's words. They had all volunteered for this mission, knowing the risks. They were humanity's last hope. As they traveled deeper into space, the light from their home planet grew dimmer. Ahead, only darkness and uncertainty awaited. The fleet moved through the stars, the ships in perfect formation as they made their way to the coordinates. The journey was long, and the deeper they traveled into space, the more uncertain the mission became. The dark expanse of space seemed endless, and with every passing moment, the feeling that they were moving into a trap grew stronger. Still, there was no turning back. Captain Joshua Wright stood at the front of the Resolute's command deck, his eyes fixed on the vast emptiness outside. The stars were distant, cold pinpricks of light, and the silence in the room was only broken by the soft hum of the ship's engines. His mind was filled with questions. Was this SOS real? Were there survivors out there? Or had this been a trap all along, designed to lure humanity's war fleet into a deadly confrontation? His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from behind him. "Captain, we've received another transmission." Lieutenant Sarah Winters called out, her voice tight with concern. Wright turned to face her. "What is it?" "It's a weak signal," she replied, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls. "It's from the same coordinates as the last one. The message is different this time." The crew fell silent as Sarah decoded the new message. It was a single sentence. "They're coming. You're too late." The words sent a chill through the room. It was clear now that something was wrong. Whatever had sent the SOS was still out there, but they didn't know what kind of danger they were walking into. The fleet pressed forward, their mission now even more urgent. On board the other ships, the tension was palpable. The soldiers, engineers, and officers on each vessel were all on high alert. Commander Elizabeth Harris, stationed on the Resolute with Captain Wright, paced back and forth as she reviewed the ship's tactical systems. Every alert, every noise made her jump, as if they were being watched by an unseen enemy. "It's too quiet," Commander Harris muttered under her breath. "I don't like this." "I don't either," Captain Wright said, his voice calm but edged with uncertainty. "But we don't have a choice. We move forward." As the fleet continued their journey, every crew member felt the weight of their decision. The warships, which had once been symbols of humanity's power and pride, now felt like fragile islands drifting through an ocean of darkness. The crew members in the lower decks tried to focus on their tasks, but the sense of dread was impossible to ignore. Even the youngest officers, who had trained for this moment their whole lives, were starting to feel the fear of the unknown. Lieutenant Winters couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every few minutes, she would glance at the nearby screens, looking for any sign of movement in the distance. But space remained silent, the empty blackness stretching on for eternity. "Captain, we're nearing the coordinates," she said, her voice betraying the tension that had built up in her. "We'll be there in 2 hours." Captain Wright took a deep breath and looked out at the stars. There was no turning back now. Whether they were walking into a trap or not, they would face whatever came with all the strength they had. The war fleet moved deeper into unknown space, toward the mysterious coordinates. The danger was growing, but so was their resolve. The fleet had entered the sector that had once been thought of as the edge of the known universe. Now it was a place where danger waited behind every star, and every empty space could hide an enemy. The silence of deep space surrounded them, pressing down on the crew like a heavy weight. Captain Joshua Wright stood on the command deck of the Resolute, watching as the dark void of space stretched out before him. His heart pounded as they neared the coordinates from which the SOS had originated. The uncertainty was suffocating, and every moment spent in this vast, empty space only made it worse. The fleet was close now, and yet they had seen no signs of life. No enemy ships, no survivors. Suddenly, the silence was shattered. An alarm blared, its loud, sharp sound echoing through the command deck. Contact. Multiple unidentified ships detected. Lieutenant Sarah Winters shouted, her voice tense with panic. Captain Wright snapped into action. On screen, he ordered. The view screen flickered to life, showing a grid of empty space. But just as quickly, the screen filled with blips of movement. Hundreds of ships, emerging from seemingly nowhere. The enemy had been hiding in the shadows of the stars, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Shields up. Battle stations. Commander Elizabeth Harris ordered, her voice calm but commanding. The fleet was under attack. In the blink of an eye, the alien ships surrounded them. They were fast, their sleek forms darting around the human warships with terrifying speed. The Resolute shuddered as enemy fire hit its shields, causing sparks to fly across the command deck. "They're everywhere," Lieutenant Winters cried, her hands moving over her console, trying to keep up with the chaos. "We're outnumbered." But Captain Wright didn't hesitate. "Return fire. Fire everything we've got." His voice was steady, even in the face of the overwhelming enemy force. The Resolute shook again as blasts of energy slammed into its shields, but the ship's powerful defenses held strong. The warships of humanity were built for this kind of fight. The crew had trained for years, and now it was time to prove themselves. Captain Wright's voice cut through the chaos. "Focus on their leader. Take down their command ship, and the rest will scatter." The fleet moved into action. Waves of energy blasts streaked through the darkness, lighting up the void like a deadly fireworks display. Human warships fired relentlessly, their advanced weapons tearing into the enemy ranks. But the alien ships were fast, darting between the human vessels, dodging blasts and retaliating with precision. Commander Harris stood by the tactical console, her eyes scanning the battle. "We need to break their formation," she muttered, already calculating their next move. The battle raged on, the warships exchanging blows in the cold emptiness of space. Each shot that hit its target made the crew's hearts race. There was no room for mistakes now. Every action, every decision, could mean the difference between survival and death. Captain Wright watched the battle unfold, knowing that their success depended on quick thinking and flawless teamwork. As the Resolute returned fire, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. And though they were outnumbered, the fleet fought with everything they had for humanity's survival. The battle was far from over. The enemy was relentless, swarming humanity's fleet from all directions. The warships fired back, their weapons lighting up the dark void of space. The Resolute shuddered as another blast hit its shields, but the crew remained focused. Time was running out. They couldn't afford to be caught in a prolonged fight. Captain Joshua Wright stood at the front of the command deck, his eyes scanning the chaos outside. They were losing valuable time. The SOS signal had been a call for help, but now it seemed like a distraction. The enemy was trying to wear them down, to keep them occupied while something else was happening. "We need to find the source of that signal," Captain Wright said, his voice grim. "If there are survivors, they're in danger. We can't let them fall into enemy hands. Commander Elizabeth Harris nodded. Agreed. We can't keep fighting blindly. We need to locate the survivors and get them out of here. The fleet was in the middle of a dangerous battle, but they had no choice. They had to take the risk and split their forces. Some ships would continue to hold off the alien attackers, while others would head toward the source of the distress signal. It was a gamble, but it was the only way. Lieutenant Winters, chart a course for the coordinates. We need to get there as fast as possible, Captain Wright ordered. Lieutenant Winters quickly got to work, tapping away at her console. Course set. We'll need to move quickly to avoid more attacks. We're not safe out here. The tension was unbearable. They knew that the enemy was watching them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The alien ships had a way of attacking in waves, overwhelming their targets before they could regroup. Every minute they spent in battle made them more vulnerable. Prepare the fleet for a tactical jump, Commander Harris said, her voice calm despite the growing pressure. We'll use the cover of our ships to get closer to the coordinates. The plan was risky. A tactical jump could give them the element of surprise, but if it went wrong, it could leave them exposed. They had to time it perfectly. As the fleet moved into position, Captain Wright glanced over at his officers. They were all in this together, and they all knew the risks. There was no room for mistakes. Let's do it, Captain Wright said, his voice steady despite the fear that tugged at his chest. On my mark. The crew held their breath as the countdown began. The ship's engines hummed louder, preparing for the jump. They were on the edge of enemy space with no guarantee of safety. But they had no choice. They had to keep moving forward. 3, 2, 1. Captain Wright's voice was calm and commanding. The fleet jumped. In an instant, the stars outside the window stretched into streaks of light as the ships leaped through hyperspace. The tension was unbearable as they moved closer to their destination, the coordinates just ahead. But as they emerged from the jump, the first thing Captain Wright saw was a terrifying sight. A massive alien battle cruiser was waiting for them, blocking the way. They had been led right into a trap. The fleet had barely escaped the trap set by the massive alien battle cruiser. The ship was positioned right in their path, blocking their way to the source of the SOS. The Resolute shuddered as its shields absorbed another barrage of enemy fire. The crew was beginning to feel the pressure. The battle was intensifying, and every moment spent in space was another moment they risked losing everything. Captain, the enemy ship is too strong. Commander Harris shouted, her voice urgent. We can't break through their defenses without taking massive losses. Captain Wright stood at the front of the command deck, looking out at the alien cruiser. It was enormous, more powerful than any ship they had faced so far. His mind raced. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to find the survivors, and they had to do it now. Lieutenant Winters scanned the area for any possible openings. Captain Wright ordered, his voice calm despite the growing chaos. Lieutenant Winters quickly got to work. I'm trying, Captain. The enemy ship has cloaking technology. It's hiding something. There's a small, unguarded gap in the cruiser's defenses, but it's risky. If we make a move, we could be spotted immediately. Captain Wright's eyes narrowed as he weighed the decision. They were running out of options. The enemy had lured them here, and now they had to make a choice. The crew was counting on him. Take the shot, he said, his voice steady. We move in. We can't afford to hesitate. The crew sprang into action, preparing the fleet for the risky maneuver. The warships broke formation, each ship darting into position to take advantage of the gap in the alien cruiser's defenses. It was a delicate move, requiring precise timing and skill. The fleet fired on the cruiser's outer defenses, creating a temporary breach. The Resolute led the way, its engines roaring as it charged through the gap, followed by the rest of the warships. The alien cruiser responded quickly, its weapons unleashing a powerful blast that struck the hull of the Resolute. Shields holding. Lieutenant Winters reported, her voice tense. but the damage is significant. We're going to need repairs." Captain Wright ignored the damage. His focus was on the mission. They had to get past the cruiser and reach the coordinates. They couldn't turn back now. Ahead of them, they saw the glowing lights of the station that had sent the SOS. It wasn't a rescue outpost. It was a prison. The human survivors were being held captive, and the alien forces were using them as bait to keep humanity at bay. "We're not here to fight," Captain Wright said, his voice sharp. "We're here to save them." Commander Harris nodded. "We'll break through, Captain. We'll get them out." As the fleet moved toward the station, the alien cruiser continued to pursue them, firing relentlessly. The battle raged on, but Captain Wright's resolve was clear. He couldn't let the survivors be lost. Not after everything they had been through. They were finally at the heart of the enemy's territory. It wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. It was a race against time, and the fate of the human survivors hung in the balance. The battle had not stopped, and the warships of humanity's fleet fought fiercely to push through the alien forces. The Resolute continued to lead the charge, its shields flickering under the constant barrage of alien weapons. The crew was tired but determined, each member doing their best to hold the line. But in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected was happening within the fleet. In the lower levels of the Resolute, Lieutenant Commander Mark Duval, once a trusted officer, moved swiftly through the corridors. His footsteps echoed in the quiet hallways, but his expression was anything but calm. A dark cloud of suspicion hung over him, and his mind had already made up its choice. The moment he had been waiting for was finally here. He entered the communications room, where a small team of officers were monitoring the fleet's communications. They barely looked up as he approached, too focused on their work. He ignored them and turned toward the control panel. "Duval, what are you doing here?" one officer asked, but Duval didn't respond. His fingers moved quickly across the console, disabling the security lockouts that had been set up to protect the fleet's commands. His betrayal had been planned for weeks. He had been in contact with the Xylar, secretly negotiating with them for a higher position in their ranks. The humans were weak, he had convinced himself, and they had failed to realize that the galaxy was not meant for them. He had always felt like a second-class officer, never getting the recognition he deserved. But now, with the fleet about to be destroyed, it was time for him to take control. Duval smiled as he entered the access codes, sending a silent signal to the Xylar. His betrayal was now in motion. Up on the command deck, Captain Wright's voice rang out as he monitored the battle. "We're almost there. We just need to clear this last wave of enemies, and then we can rescue the survivors." But as the captain spoke, the tension in the room began to rise. Commander Harris, watching the status of their shields, noticed something strange. "Captain, the fleet is pulling back. Some of the ships are retreating." "What do you mean, retreating?" Captain Wright asked, his heart skipping a beat. The fleet was supposed to be moving forward, not retreating. "It's coming from the lower levels of the Resolute," Commander Harris said, her voice tight. "The signal is different. Someone's overriding the commands." A cold feeling ran through Captain Wright as the realization hit him. It's a sabotage. Someone's sabotaging the fleet. They quickly realized that Mark Duval, a trusted officer, had been the one behind the chaos. He had somehow turned against them. And now he was working with the Xylar to ensure humanity's defeat. "Duval," Captain Wright shouted, his anger clear. "You traitor." Duval, now safely in contact with the Xylar, watched as his plan unfolded. He had sent false orders to the fleet, causing confusion and weakening their coordination. As he watched the enemy ships take advantage of the disarray, he felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. But just as he prepared to leave his post and meet his new allies, he was stopped. The door to the communications room slammed open, and Lieutenant Winters stood there, her face filled with shock and anger. "You betrayed us," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You sold us out." Mark Duval turned slowly to face her. His expression was cold, almost emotionless. "I did what I had to do. The Xylar are the future. Humans were never meant to rule this galaxy. Winter's eyes blazed with fury. You're wrong. You'll never be part of their future. With a swift movement, Winters activated the security override, locking Duval in the room as the alarms blared. He was no longer in control. The fleet would know the truth. The battle raged on, but despite the internal sabotage, humanity's fleet was not giving up. The Resolute and the other warships fought hard against the relentless alien forces. Captain Reich's command deck was filled with tension. The crew was exhausted, and their resources were running low, but they couldn't stop now. They had already lost too much. The battle for survival wasn't just about their lives. It was about saving the human survivors trapped behind enemy lines. "Captain, we've regained control," Lieutenant Winters reported. Her voice was full of relief, but it was clear that the damage had already been done. The betrayal by Duval had caused chaos, but now they had to focus on the mission. "Good," Captain Wright said, but his eyes remained focused on the battlefield. "We've lost time, and the enemy knows it. Keep your focus. We need to push forward." The crew, though shaken by the betrayal, responded with determination. Commander Harris issued orders to the fleet, reorganizing their forces. They were a smaller, weaker unit now, but they still had humanity's most advanced warships at their disposal. The alien forces, though large and strong, couldn't match the firepower of the human fleet. Captain Wright's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden transmission. It was a voice he hadn't heard before, a voice filled with fear. "Captain Wright, please, you have to hurry." The voice crackled through the comms. "We don't have much time. The Xylar are preparing to move us." The transmission cut off abruptly, but it was clear who the voice belonged to. One of the human survivors, trapped and desperate for rescue. The urgency in their voice hit Captain Wright hard. This wasn't just a battle for victory. It was a race against time to save lives. "We're almost there," Captain Wright said, his voice steady, but inside, his heart raced. "Hold tight. We're coming." The fleet's remaining ships pushed forward with everything they had left. The alien ships tried to stop them, but the human warships fought back with fury. The Xylar had underestimated humanity's strength, and now they would feel the full force of the war fleet. Every ship, every officer, every crew member was giving their all. Minutes felt like hours as the Resolute closed in on the station that held the survivors. The alien battle cruiser that had blocked their way earlier was now in ruins, destroyed in the fierce exchange of fire. But the cost had been high. The Resolute's shields were failing, and several other ships in the fleet had taken heavy damage. "We're almost there," Commander Harris shouted. "Get ready for the rescue operation." With one final push, the Resolute broke through the last line of alien defenses. The fleet had made it. They had reached the station, but as the ship hovered near the docking bay, Captain Wright looked out over the battlefield. Many of their ships were heavily damaged, and the fleet had lost too many good men and women. The battle wasn't over, but for Captain Wright, the victory was bittersweet. They had done it. They had reached the survivors and stopped the enemy from taking over, but the cost had been immense. The fleet, though victorious, had been forever changed. As the Resolute prepared to dock, Captain Wright looked at his crew. They had sacrificed everything to get here, and now they would face the hard truth of their victory. The war was not over, but for today, they had done the impossible. The battle had come to a brutal end, but the cost of victory was painfully clear. The warships that had once seemed invincible were now scarred, their hulls battered by countless alien blasts. The Resolute had taken the most damage, but it was still operational, though its shields were barely holding. Captain Wright stood at the command deck, looking at the ruined fleet before him. They had won the battle, but the victory had come at a terrible price. The crew was exhausted. Their faces were drawn, their movements slow. Some had lost friends, others had seen their comrades fall in battle. But despite the fatigue, there was a sense of relief. The human survivors had been rescued, their faces pale and filled with gratitude, as they boarded the Resolute. The mission had been a success, but it felt hollow. The cost of their success weighed heavy on every soul aboard the fleet. Captain Wright turned to Commander Harris, his expression hard as he surveyed the damage to their ships. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. Harris didn't sugarcoat the situation. "We've lost 2 ships entirely. The others are heavily damaged, Captain. Repairs will take weeks, maybe longer. But we made it. We got the survivors out, and the alien fleet is in full retreat." Wright nodded but didn't respond. The sight of their damaged fleet, the cost of so many lives, haunted him. The sense of pride he had once felt in commanding this fleet had been replaced by a deep, aching emptiness. They had accomplished their mission, but the price was higher than anyone could have imagined. "Lieutenant Winters," Captain Wright called, his voice low. "Any sign of the enemy? Are they regrouping?" Winters glanced at her console, her fingers flying over the controls. "No, Captain. The Xylar forces are retreating, but we're still getting scattered signals from their ships. They'll be back. Of that, I'm sure." "Understood," Wright said, his mind already racing with plans for the future. "We need to get these ships patched up and ready for the next fight. We can't afford to relax." As the fleet began to regroup, the survivors were taken to secure areas within the Resolute. Their stories were filled with fear, but also hope. They had been held captive by the Xylar, used as bait to trap humanity's strongest fleet. Now, they were free. They owed their lives to the fleet, but Captain Wright couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the last of the alien threat. The mission had been a success, but the war was far from over. They had won today, but there would be more battles. The Xylar had tasted humanity's strength, and they would come again, angrier and more determined to wipe them out. As the crew worked tirelessly to repair the Resolute, Captain Wright stood by the viewports, staring out into the endless darkness of space. He could hear the hum of the ship's engines, a steady reminder that they had survived. But there was no time to rest. The war had only just begun. He turned away from the view and headed toward the command center. The crew needed him now, more than ever. They had proven their strength, but the road ahead would be harder than anything they had faced before. The battle had been won, but the war was still ongoing, and humanity's future was still uncertain. The warships of humanity's fleet floated silently in space, their engines now quieter after the long, exhausting battle. The Resolute stood proudly in the center, though it was scared and worn. The crew had done their best to repair the damage, but it would take time before the ship was truly ready to fight again. The survivors of the Xylar's attack had been safely relocated, and now, with the immediate threat over, Captain Wright's thoughts turned toward the future. They had won the battle, but they knew the war was far from over. The Xylar had retreated for now, but it was only a matter of time before they came back, stronger and more prepared. Humanity had shown its strength in this battle, but there was a price to pay. The fleet had taken heavy losses, and many of the brave soldiers who fought with them would never return home. As Captain Wright walked through the corridors of the Resolute, he saw the faces of his crew. They were tired, their eyes heavy with the weight of what they had just been through. Some smiled in relief, grateful to have made it through. Others, however, carried the weight of loss. Their comrades gone, never to return. Wright's heart ached for them, but he knew that they couldn't afford to grieve too long. The Xylar were still out there, and they would be back. He entered the command deck, where Commander Harris and Lieutenant Winters were working. They both looked up as he approached, their faces serious but hopeful. "We did it, Captain," Harris said quietly, the exhaustion in her voice evident. "We saved the survivors. The fleet is still standing, and we're still alive." Wright nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. "We won today, but the fight is far from over. We've shown them what humanity is capable of, but the Xylar won't forget that. We need to be ready for what comes next." "We will be," Winters said firmly. "We'll rebuild, and we'll fight harder. The Xylar may have underestimated us, But they won't make that mistake again. Wright looked at them, his heart swelling with pride. The crew had done more than survive. They had proven that humanity could stand against any force, no matter how powerful. They had shown courage, strength, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. "We'll be ready," Wright said, his voice calm and strong. "We'll rebuild, and we'll come back stronger. This is just the beginning. Humanity's future is still ours to shape." As the crew worked to prepare the Resolute and the rest of the fleet for their next move, Captain Wright stood by the viewports, looking out at the stars. The galaxy was vast and filled with danger, but humanity had proven that it was more than capable of protecting itself. The road ahead would not be easy, but Captain Wright knew one thing for sure: humanity was not going to back down. They had faced their darkest hour and come out victorious. The Xylar might have thought they could destroy them, but humanity's fire had only grown brighter. With resolve in his heart, Captain Wright turned back to face his crew. They had made it through the hardest battle they had ever faced. Now, they would move forward. Together, they would secure humanity's place in the stars.